It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster.
I think the plan for change is working, and the fact that inflation is coming down is a sign of that.
We shouldn't be popping champagne corks over this from the fact that this government came into office promising growth. Growth has been killed stone dead.
As inflation falls slightly to 2.5%, is Rachel Reeves over the worst of the current crisis?
The economic headwinds that we face are a reminder that we should, indeed we must, go further and faster in our plan to kickstart economic growth that plunged under the last government.
But are net zero policies driving that growth or impeding it?
I think people historically have been more concerned about not being seen racist than they have been concerned about protecting children. That has to change, and it has to change right now.
She's been raising awareness of the sexual abuse of girls by grooming gangs for over a decade. We'll ask Labour MP Sarah Champion why she now thinks there needs to be a new national inquiry.
Should you have resigned sooner?
City Minister Tulip Siddiq resigns after a probe by the Prime Minister's ethics advisor. It's likely to come up when Keir Starmer faces Kemi Badenoch at Prime Minister's questions. We'll bring you that live at noon. Joining us today, Conservative peer Eleanor Lang, Labour MP Sarah Champion, Green MP Ellie Chowns and Telegraph columnist Tim Stanley. This is Politics Live. Hello and welcome. Let's start with the inflation figures out today. The BBC News headline, UK inflation falls to 2.5% in December. Yes, the rate at which prices are increasing is slightly down on the previous month, but above the 2% Bank of England target. Let's speak to the BBC's economics editor, Faisal Islam. Hello to you, Faisal. The government's handling of the economy has very much been in the spotlight in recent days and weeks, partly because of UK borrowing costs hitting a record high, well, certainly for the last 30 years or so. This slight dip in the rate of inflation, what will it mean in terms of market reaction?
Well, a 0.1% fall, or increase for that matter, is kind of in a way neither here nor there. It's basically pretty much flat in terms of the rate of inflation. But what I think is undoubtedly positive are the underlying kind of price pressure dynamics that you can see in the detail of the inflation numbers. Things like services inflation and what is known as core inflation, which strips out the more volatile elements. And they give you an indication of where inflation is going, not in December last month, but where it's going to go over the next 6 months and a year. And critically, it is what the Bank of England looks at when they set interest rates. Is inflation going to be sticky, essentially? And those did fall in a notable way. Core inflation is down to a 4-year low. Services inflation is down to 4.4%. And what that means is that some of the barriers that Bank of England rate setters, they have a committee of 9 that decides, some of the barriers that they've seen to a rate cut next month and perhaps further rate cuts in the future are going away for now, or they're less than they thought. And so the markets are betting on further rate cuts, and that has helped those borrowing rates that you talked about that have definitely crept up in the UK and around the world. And those have come down today. They're still pretty high in absolute terms, still enough to make a difficult set of maths for Rachel Reeves and potentially a course correction, but relief, safe harbour in choppy global waters.
Right. What will it mean then in terms of the choices the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, may have to make in the not-too-distant future?
I think it means there's a chance that things could stabilise in terms of the specific pressure on the UK, and that was twofold. The idea that the UK economy is particularly sticky in terms of inflation. While today's figures lean against that story, UK inflation is likely to be right bang in the middle of the pack in terms of the G7. The broader story about is there really a sustainable and detailed and convincing growth plan of the UK, I think that's still up for grabs. The Treasury, the Chancellor has outlined a whole series of institutions and procedures and emphasised stability, but what we haven't seen is a detailed set of trade-offs as to the political pain they will take in terms of trying to deliver growth. And what's really interesting is this, which is there's all this turbulence coming from Trump trade tariffs, but it's about uncertainty. We don't quite know what the inflationary impacts will be on the rest of the world. We don't quite know what the impact of the national insurance rise will be on inflation, because it could also squeeze wages. So lots of uncertainty, but as I say, in stormy seas, a bit of safe harbour from today's numbers, and they got away a £4 billion debt auction pretty comfortably this morning, albeit at 4.8% interest rates.
Faisal Islam, thank you very much. Is Rachel Reeves out of the woods, do you think?
Well, it's not about Rachel Reeves. I don't like this personalisation of politics. The problem is the entire Labour government's economic policy, not Rachel Reeves herself.
Although she is in charge, isn't she, as Chancellor, when it comes to the UK's finances?
And quite rightly, the emphasis is upon her. But let's be honest about this. It's good to have a small fall in inflation. That is good. But as Faisal said, the long-term outlook is still not good. But let us hope that this inflation going in the right direction, i.e. down, will give a little bit of confidence. Because when this government came in, the first thing they did was slash confidence. And that was a bad policy. They seem to have stopped doing that now. I hope they will now concentrate on the actual nuts and bolts of economic policy rather than politics.
Well, Sarah, you might want to respond to that more generally, but also the question that the spotlight has been on the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, rightly or wrongly. Do you think she's over the worst of this crisis?
Yes, I think so. I mean, Faisal said that the sort of 0.1% is negligible, but I'm quite sure the opposition would be baying for our blood if it had gone up by 0.1%. What I think this is showing is the longer-term plan that she's put in place is starting to work. And the thing that I'm most excited about is the industrial strategy, which we've been asking for 10 years, is finally coming on the table. And I want that confidence to both our manufacturing sector, but also sort of to the global financial world to say, look, we're here, it's long-term, we're steadying the ship, you can have confidence in the UK again.
Do you have confidence? Do you think the Chancellor is out of the woods now?
Well, I think what we've seen is, the sort of thing that gets whipped up within politics, and it comes up over a few days and then it goes away again. And
well, partly
people
because political parties have raised it, like the Conservatives.
Well, exactly. They try to pick on somebody each week, and each week is a different person. And, the reality is that underlying it, things, as we've just heard from Faisal, there isn't anything particularly bad going on with inflation at the moment. But I do think that there are questions that need to be asked about the government in terms of their economic strategy. So what they've done since they've come in, they've put taxes on work rather than on wealth. They've failed to make the sorts of investment that we need in the kind of green transformation to our economy that we really need to thrive going into the future. And so I think that, as a Green MP, my role is to kind of hold their feet to the fire on that and really push for more action.
Well, we're going to talk about that in just a moment. Do you think, Tim, that Rachel Reeves is now over the worst of what's been seen as a crisis for her personally?
I don't think she was ever in the woods. We got used to this idea under the Tories that Prime Ministers and Chancellors change every 5 minutes like scarves or gloves in winter. But the reality is that if you have a large majority and if the Prime Minister has confidence in you, the Chancellor doesn't go, and nor should they. And it would be contrary to the government's securonomics approach to start dropping chancellors at the drop of a hat. But at the same time, in the same way that it would be silly to accuse the Labour government of underperformance in economics when it's only been in office for 6 months, it's a little silly to accuse it to welcome overperformance and things like this shift. It is far too soon to judge the impact of government performance. And of course, we have seen some policies like the rise in national insurance contributions, or we're going to go on to discuss green policy, that could end up restricting growth. So we're all relieved that inflation has stabilised, but what are going to be the long-term impacts of what the government's doing?
Well, one of the long-term impacts could be decisions about spending or making cuts, because if the borrowing costs have gone up, if the government is paying more to service its debt, then there will be less money to go round. You could raise taxes, but Rachel Reeves says she's not going to do that. If she makes cuts to spending, particularly welfare, how will that make you feel, Sarah?
It's tough. I mean, the cuts and decisions that have been made already are difficult for me to swallow, but I have to trust in the process that's going on here, which is to get stability back in this country and get confidence back in this country. And yeah, that's not going to take, a week, 6 months. It's probably not even going to take the term of a parliament. But I think we need to actually do something to try and get this country back to a position where the global world has confidence in us. And that's been broken very, very dramatically in the last few years.
So you say it will be tough
yes.
for you and perhaps your constituents, but
will you
accept it though?
What I won't accept is if things are just rolled out without us being able to try and soften the impact on those that are going to be most disproportionately affected. And I have to say, some of the decisions have caught us all by surprise. And had we been spoken to, we could have said, well, what about doing this? What about taking,
What are you talking about?
I'm particularly talking about WASPy women. I mean, that pains me. And there were a group of women who were very disproportionately affected by that, and we could have mitigated some of the impact on that had we had that conversation. And I hope going forwards the government is more in listening mode when we bring issues like that to them.
All right, well, we're talking broadly about the economy, and you'll remember on Monday the Prime Minister Keir Starmer set out very clearly how he wants to make the UK an AI superpower. But is one of the big problems the energy price level. Let's just have a look at this in the Sun newspaper. Keir Starmer's grand AI ambitions won't get anywhere until Britain brings down its sky-high energy costs. How big a problem do you think that's going to be, Sarah?
Massive. I mean, in my constituency, I've got two heavy industry businesses. One's glass and the other one's steel. And we are not on a level playing field with the rest of Europe, and these businesses are going to go bust unless we do something about it.
Right. I mean, Ellie, that's a problem, isn't it, if you can't bring down energy prices?
Energy prices are a real issue. They've really affected households. People have felt it in their pockets over the last few years. And as Sarah says, it's an issue for industry as well. There are some, really important things that we need to do. One is to accelerate the transition to clean, green, renewable energy as quickly as possible, because that is the cheapest energy. And one of the problems we've got at the moment is the electricity price is basically hooked to the gas price, and that drives up energy prices overall. So decoupling the electricity and gas price would be really, really important to bring down people's electricity bills. But fundamentally, the generating cost of renewable energy, once you've got the infrastructure there, is basically zero. It's really, really cheap. It's a long-term transition that we should have done earlier, and we need to accelerate it even faster.
But in the meantime, industries aren't going to come here. They're going to be put off by those high energy prices, particularly those like tech, which need a lot of energy.
To go back to what we were talking about earlier, in the short run, the government's whole policy is balancing the budget. It thinks in the long run, however, that Britain will come through it by gambling on certain things like AI and renewables, and also an expansion of house building. The problem is there are lots of structural things that stand in the way of us doing that. And one of the key ones, as you've said, is the price of electricity. Now, it's absolutely right that part of the problem is the price of gas and that we are so dependent upon it. We did okay during the North Sea oil boom. That's ended. And now we are dangerously exposed because after the pandemic, demand increased, but supply went down because of the war in Russia. And the result is that Britain is buying really expensive foreign gas. There's some good news on that, which has been a global investment in gas, which means that there could be an increase in supply coming down the chain. But nonetheless, it means that while the government is waiting for various things to take off, like AI, which, by the way, is very energy intensive, Britain finds itself stuck with a really high energy price, which puts off investors. No one, basically everyone around this table, I'm sure, would agree with that analysis. The debate is around, so how do we increase supply domestically? And the left and Ed Miliband are saying, well, this is the chance to not only increase supply, but save the planet by going green. And what the right would say is the problem with that is in the long run, maybe, it's like going off a cliff really fast and hoping you land on the other side. But in the short term, the costs of going green are passed on to the consumer in terms of subsidies. And also they are not quite there yet. They're not quite efficient enough such that when the wind doesn't blow, when the sun doesn't shine, we have to fall back onto the old devil of gas.
Let me come to you in just a moment. Ellen, what do you think?
Well, this is where ideology clashes with reality. We're all in favour of net zero. We all want to save the planet. But this government's policy of accelerating to net zero without having the infrastructure and the other sources of energy in place simply forces us into a position where we become more dependent on imports, therefore prices go up, and we are not energy safe. We're not secure within our own borders of producing energy. Now, Ellie's absolutely right that it will be great one day when we can depend on renewables. It will be great one day. But in the meantime, the dash to renewables and for example, completely ignoring nuclear as if it wasn't a possibility out of sheer outdated ideology is simply wrong, and it's not doing the people of this country a favour, and it's not good for the economy and for industry.
I'm afraid the ideology on show here is what we're seeing from Eleanor and from Tim. The reality of the climate crisis means we have to stop burning fossil fuels. The reality is that renewable energy is the cheapest form of energy. The reality is that, as Nick Stern said to us 20 years ago, if we invest now, it'll be much less costly for the economy than if we wait. We've already waited far too long.
But the reality is that the renewables aren't there yet. They aren't there yet.
That's why we need government policy to accelerate it. And I welcome what the Labour government is doing to accelerate renewable energy generation. And we've got to talk about energy efficiency, and we've got to talk about investment in grid infrastructure. We've had governments for decades that have failed to invest in the grid. So I was just talking at the weekend about a car battery factory in the Midlands that has problems with grid infrastructure. That's what's holding back investment. Right. We need government policy to work on energy efficiency and the infrastructure investment, and that will give us that green economic transformation.
Sarah?
I've maybe got a bridge between these two positions and a shameless plug for my constituency of Rotherham.
Of course.
We have the Advanced Manufacturing Centre there, and some of the businesses have got all of the solutions to this. So we've got small modular reactors. We need government investment to expand it. And I know it will sound like a huge amount of money, for £2 billion, you can build one of these small modular reactors, which then powers 1 million homes for 60 years. We also have a great business called Isotope, which what it does is, servers use a lot of electricity and they generate a lot of heat. They put water, a fluid in there to manage all of that. What we need to see from government is let's celebrate the research and the innovation we've got, but we need government start-up money on that initial infrastructure investment, and then we're good to go.
Right, but you say you're good to go, but at the moment, how do you get growth if you can't get industries to come to the UK to invest, expand, or even start up when energy prices are up here?
Well, it goes back to our original point that we need stability in the market to be seen that, an investment here isn't going to be losing money. We also need the industrial strategy, and we need confidence in the government that's actually going to deliver.
Right.
And the best way to put confidence forward is to put some cash on the table.
Right. I mean, I don't know whether Rachel Reeves is talking to you about that sort of cash being on the table, but if you can't bring energy prices down because of the transition to green policies, if that is what the government is thinking, then should the net zero target be delayed or abandoned?
Of course not, and it's a complete misnomer to suggest that we can't bring energy prices down because of net zero. The reason energy prices have gone up is because of crises in global fuel market, fossil fuel markets. There's a very immediate policy lever that we can operate right now, which is the decoupling of the electricity and gas price. And if there's one thing that I'd like, Sarah, to take back to Rachel, it's let's do that. That will benefit industry and consumers.
Well, not everyone agrees. The Daily Telegraph here is quoting Bank of England official Sarah Breeden, I think her name is. She's a deputy governor at the Bank of England, saying net zero is driving up energy prices for households and for businesses. They are paying more for their energy because of what she calls carbon permits. Do you accept that?
There has historically been some investment in the energy industry into net zero, and that has had some effect on energy prices.
So she's right.
It's not the major influence. The major influence on energy prices in the last few years is fossil fuel prices relating particularly to the Russian war on Ukraine. geopolitics has a real influence here.
Well,
but we've got to think, Tim talked about in the long run. In the long run, we're all dead. But, in the medium
let's look on the brighter side.
But in the medium long run, we've got to look on the bright side and actually tackle the climate crisis. Net zero is an investment that we have to make up front.
Well, of course we have to make that investment, but what about other investments in the clean production of energy from the North Sea, for example? Aberdeen in the northeast of Scotland was but just let me finish. Aberdeen in the northeast of Scotland was booming as an energy supplier for this country for many decades. And now government policy, both in Scotland and in Westminster, is undermining that. We can produce clean energy with the right investment from the North Sea. In combination,
fossil fuels.
Because we still need fossil fuels as well as renewables.
It's not clean.
It's cloud cuckoo land to say we can completely rely on renewables.
But it isn't clean energy.
It's
Ellie has a point.
It's a possible form of energy.
Well,
no, but there's new technology that can be used in the North Sea.
It's really unproven and it's incredibly expensive. Renewables are far, far cheaper than fossil fuels with CCS. Far cheaper.
Could we, if we took net zero off the table when we're talking about energy, could we just
It's difficult, though, isn't it, to take away, because people are making these connections in industry. This isn't us making a connection. Again, the Daily Telegraph, British industry faces extinction because of net zero, says Jim Ratcliffe.
But he is the most trusted commentator.
But whether he's trusted or not, he is in charge of INEOS and does know something about manufacturing.
And INEOS makes a lot of money out of this.
Sure.
But could we also just look at it from a pure security point of view? So we are reliant on dictators around the world that run petrochemical states. Is this a position that we want to be in, or do we want to get to a position where we're in control of our own energy? So the net zero thing is, of course, the issue that everybody raises because it's a divisive issue. But this, for me, is as much about security as it is about net zero. And we need to be making that change, making that investment, celebrating our own manufacturing capabilities and just getting on with it.
Right, but will it get growth? Will it get economic growth that the government wants to see?
It'll get some economic growth in some areas, but there are always trade-offs with any kind of technological revolution. And that's one of the things that frustrates me about this debate, is I feel that left and right-wing governments have not been honest for the last few years about the impacts of going green. The tone was set by Boris Johnson, which was we can become the Saudi of wind, as if we just need to flick a switch and suddenly there's an abundance of energy. No, it costs money to make the transition. Some jobs are lost in the process. Some costs we pass on to the consumers. We have been paying big bills for the last few years in order to subsidise going green. There is an interesting philosophical division between the Tories and Labour on this, who both believe in net zero, which is about the role of the state. And broadly speaking, the Tory view was we'll set the targets, but we'll allow the private sector to get there through technological innovation. Labour's position is slightly different. It's the government should throw itself behind it, it should guide it, direct it, and it should help to build the infrastructure. And I'm not unsympathetic towards that argument because, for instance, one reason why we are dangerously exposed is lack of investment in gas storage. One reason why we are exposed is because we weren't building the nuclear plants. You suddenly have Conservatives saying we should go nuclear. Well, we could have gone nuclear, or the Conservatives will say the Lib Dems nixed it, but nonetheless... There's been a failure to invest in these things, and that's one reason why we're so exposed. The problem is I come back to is Labour will then say we must do this, but then some other aspect of its policy will actually harm the economy in such ways, such as putting national insurance contributions up, or possibly the new employment laws, or some new regulation here or there. So basically all these things are about trade-offs.
Right.
We should just be honest that we're just trying to all together find the right way forward.
Right. Well, in terms of trade-offs, though, Ellie, have you spoken to your Green MP colleague Adrian Ramsey? Here is in the East Anglian Daily Times. Well, the headline is about him. You spoke about the need for energy infrastructure, and he slams the Waveney Valley Pylons decision, and that would be the way to transmit, or transport, I should say, cheap electricity. He's against it.
Now, Adrian has spent his entire life working in the renewable energy industry.
Yeah, but he doesn't want the infrastructure that you said is so important.
Adrian has been saying for a while that he wants a proper evaluation of all the options, because there are alternatives to pylons, i.e. undergrounding. Right. If I could just finish on this particular
but he's slowing it down. You admit that then?
No. Actually, his whole point is because it will take quite a few years to build the actual wind turbines, that a proper review of the options of undergrounding versus pylons will not slow it down.
How urgent
at
is the
all.
climate emergency?
It's completely urgent.
Right,
And this
so
is the
why is
point
he blocking the infrastructure
not.
that you say is necessary? Well, well he is, because we've actually had him on the programme and talked to him about it. He wants alternatives, he wants more consultations, and this is a Green MP, as you said, spent his whole life committed to promoting green policies, but not this one.
Can I just be clear? Adrian is not blocking any renewable energy at all. He's a champion for renewable energy. In any particular installation, you've got to think about the details of what's most appropriate. And I don't know the details for Waveney Valley, what's most appropriate there. But the specific thing I would say, the costs of not taking action are huge. If we just think at what we saw last week in LA, it was burning, the city was burning. The billions, trillions of damage that is going to be caused if we don't grasp the nettle on climate change, take these opportunities for investment, transformational investment, that will drive our economy forward at much faster speed than continuing to do the same old business as usual. We're too late already in doing that, but it's not too late.
First of all, by the way, going green is a business in and of itself. People are making money out of this. Let's not pretend they're charity workers. Secondly, the point that this row raises is that a lot of people don't want this transition happening in their own backyard. If you take the case of onshore wind, for some reason, people seem to think it's wonderful. It may well be in terms of generation, but I wouldn't want to live near one of those damn things.
But we can have
they
community
are scarring
benefits.
the landscape. The community benefit, yeah, but ultimately you are destroying the landscape in order to build these things, where a small nuclear reactor somewhere, hidden somewhere, perhaps, I don't know, beneath someone's stairs or something, you wouldn't even have to look at the wretched.
They're about the
there
size
are
of two
costs.
football pitches.
If you travel, a lot of places in Europe, you'll see a lot more wind turbines, and people don't feel that their landscape has been destroyed
because their countries are
or
vast.
scarred.
Ours is not. Ours is beautiful and small, and it's just being scarred by wind turbines.
And that is why offshore wind is particularly a particularly powerful option. But fundamentally,
it can be more expensive. But let me just bring the others in, Ellie, because you mentioned Tim about nuclear, and you talked about it. But what did happen over 14 years of Conservatives in government? Nothing.
I disagree with what happened during the 14 years, and yes, it was to do with the coalition, etc., etc. But there's no point in looking backwards. We've got to look forwards. It was wrong not to invest in nuclear.
Yes, it was.
And it's wrong now not to invest in nuclear.
Yes.
And I don't understand what is the practical objection to investing in nuclear. As Sarah said, the small nuclear generators are our new generation of nuclear production.
The cost is one particular issue, isn't it?
Yeah,
billions.
$2 billion for one.
Yes,
but much more expensive than renewables.
But it also works, and it works in the long term. And don't forget the importance of energy security. And look, we all want net zero. We all want renewables.
So why won't we all support the policies that will get us there?
Because the current policy will damage the economy, and damaging the economy doesn't end up with a good result.
All right, Sarah, just finally, and then we must move on.
The problem that we've got is, for 14 years, there wasn't the investment in the infrastructure. So plugging in electric cars, for example, the battery storage, another example. So now we're going to have to, if we're going to make these transitions that everybody has agreed to, it's going to be expensive, and we need the government to step up and put some cash in.
All right, let's talk about the issue of grooming gangs. It was certainly one that came up at Prime Minister's Questions. In fact, it dominated Kemi Badenoch's exchanges with Keir Starmer last week. And have a look at this tweet from you, Sarah, from yesterday. I've published my 5-point plan to ensure children are safeguarded. Victims and survivors can access the support that they need. Perpetrators are brought to justice, and those in authority are held to account. This includes a national inquiry into grooming gangs, which the government has said no to. It's rejected that particular idea. And you've changed your mind too. Why?
We don't want just another national inquiry that takes 7 years, costs nearly £200 million, comes up with some recommendations that then don't get implemented. We've done that. What I'm proposing is a package that goes around it, because I really think the country is very concerned that there are cover-ups when it comes to justice for these girls. There clearly isn't the support in place for the victims and survivors. And so I think the only way that we can get to a point where we can make sure that child abuse as a whole is addressed, but also this specific type of child abuse is addressed, is by having inquiries into it alongside all of the recommendations that came out from the last £200 million inquiry.
Right,
So
I mean,
it's not an either or, it's a let's put everything together, let's sort this once and for all.
Have you talked to the Prime Minister about it and tried to
have not.
persuade him?
I have talked to his Chief of Staff about it, though.
And?
He's very sympathetic, he gets the problem.
But about a national inquiry?
Yes.
Is there any movement, do you think?
I hope so. I mean, what we have to be, again, it goes back to the discussion we've been having earlier about the time things take. There are two pieces of legislation coming through, the Children and Wellbeings Act bill and the Police and Justice Act bill. Both of those have got the opportunity to embed the changes that we need to see into law so that we can start moving on all of this.
I mean, you have been raising awareness. You're a powerful advocate, as many others are too, demanding justice for the victims of grooming gangs for over a decade, and there have been a number of very high-profile cases, as you well know. This was an article that you wrote in 2017. British Pakistani men are raping and exploiting white girls, and it's time we faced up to it. Labour MP for Rotherham, and at the time Shadow Secretary of State for Women and Equality's comments on a horrific trend in grooming and sexual abuse by gangs. Now, in the end, you were asked to change the language, retract the language, you apologised and you resigned from that post. Why?
I didn't want to cause offence by saying what I said. What I wanted to do was get the particular type of abuse that we were having in Rotherham recognised, dealt with.
Right, but do you wish you'd stuck to your guns now and not resigned at that time and stuck to the language you used?
So there were many people, particularly in the Pakistani community, who were very upset and got targeted as a consequence of the things that I said. I feel great shame that I caused hate crime to certain groups of people. Do I regret what I said? I regret the way that I said it. I do not regret calling out the particular type of grooming that was going on by Pakistani men in my constituency and in many other constituencies.
But you will know that the report by Professor Alexis Jay did highlight the reluctance of local authorities and the police to properly pursue claims the perpetrators, that were mainly British men of Pakistani heritage, for fears of being called racist. Do you think attitudes within the Labour Party now have changed in terms of fears of potentially, yes, being called racist or worried about sensitivities within communities?
I think there is overwhelming evidence that there are particularly there are groups of people who carry out specific crimes. So there are Pakistani groups of men that are carrying out this form of grooming. I also know of Albanian people. There are people in particular professions that carry out specific types of sexual exploitation. I wish from the very beginning that people just dealt with the crime and that religion, race, professions, influence made absolutely no difference, because we need to see the law being applied fairly regardless. One of the indicators of the crime is, of course, the groups that you hang around with. So whether it's the local cricket club or whether you're a part of the Church of England, that is one of the indicators that you need to look at. But the law shouldn't have any favouritism or blind spots when it comes to prosecutions.
And you think there were blind spots?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I'm sure the people, I don't know, I hope the people thought they were doing it for the right reasons. What they actually did was made a bad situation absolutely horrific.
Eleanor?
Well, I remember when Sarah resigned, and I remember when she said what you've just quoted, and I thought it was very sad at the time that the politics of the situation was masking the important thing, which was the terrible things that were happening and are still happening to these young girls. And it was so sad that Sarah had to resign, because she was a very strong voice on this matter and has been for a very long time, and she's been proved right. It's such a pity that we let this, oh, you mustn't be racist attitude get in the way of seeing the reality. Again, it's ideology against reality. And the reality is that we need an inquiry to get to the bottom of what happened and what is happening. But why would having an inquiry now stop the implementation of the report that's already there? Get on with it.
Do you agree there were blind spots, that politics, sensitivities masked what was really going on, disguised it, made people reluctant to come forward?
Well, I think there are two things I want to say on this. And the first thing is I want to share the story that a woman who came to me in my constituency surgery last week shared with me, because she had given evidence to the Professor J inquiry herself, and she'd been very upset by all of the coverage last week because she'd assumed that those recommendations would have been implemented. For her, giving that testimony about the abuse that she'd experienced to that inquiry, she had hoped that that would lead to change. So she was really, really clear. Politicians have got to stop using this as a political football. We've all got to work together to get those recommendations implemented right now, and that will protect other children from abuse. The other thing to say is, you know, again, Eleanor talked about the reality. I took the trouble to look up the statistics on abuse before I came today. The reality is that actually white perpetrators are overrepresented in proportion to the population among perpetrators of sexual abuse, according to the statistics that we have. And white children are underrepresented among victims. So actually, by focusing on grooming gangs and particular ethnicities, we're only looking at what is actually less than 5% of the issue of child sexual abuse. Now, absolutely, it's clear that it's happened. It's a real issue. It's got to be addressed. It's particularly localised, as I understand it. But there is a much broader problem of child sexual abuse. 95% of it has nothing to do with the issues that are grabbing the headlines at the moment. And the only reason they're grabbing the headlines is because Musk is wading into our politics, stirring the pot in a very, very poisonous and unhelpful way. So
well, let me get Sarah to respond, because you're right about the statistics when you're talking broadly about child sexual abuse and exploitation. Grooming gangs, it's a specific strand of it. The statistics are slightly different. Well, what would you say?
Well, the problem is that some of the recommendations, or one of the key ones that came out of the independent inquiry that we had, was to get robust data, because there aren't unified data sets. So we don't actually know the ethnicity of either the perpetrators or the victims. So it becomes very difficult to make those sort of statistical statements about it. I was also involved in a Home Office inquiry, specifically looking at networks and gangs, and that was another recommendation to get proper robust data from them, so that we can actually, and I think that's why I've sort of one of the things I'm calling for 5 things is to get some sort of realistic data across the country of the particular forms of child sexual exploitation. We don't know, and that allows us to speculate. And Eleanor's absolutely right. This is going on everywhere across the country, and this is just one form of child abuse. The ICSA inquiry was to try and prevent all forms of child abuse, and that's what I really want us to do.
But there are fears, certainly raised last week at Prime Minister's questions, that there might have been and might still be a sense of a cover-up, if you like, that questions haven't been asked. You've written this piece. Yes, you answer that first, and then we'll come to
what the cover-up which makes this issue
exactly
specific. So to discuss it and then to throw it back into, but of course, all sorts of children are raped by all sorts of people, is to bury the specific issue, which is that this one phenomenon happened and we fear may have been covered up. And it is the covering up which makes it doubly evil, because the notion that because of something we all want to avoid, which is racial tension, we might use that good intention and in the course of pursuing that, end up covering up, excusing, ignoring some form of child abuse. I'm sorry, but that is what makes this case specifically evil.
But there have been cover-ups in other settings, of course.
Of course there have.
Church England, just recently.
But I'm sorry, but the left is always complaining about whataboutery. Well, this is a classic example of whataboutery. You could say there have been abuse in lots of other cases. OK, we're talking about this one right now.
And that's the absolute nub of it. And that's what I was reflecting on and speaking to people about over the weekend. And that's why I'm calling for an inquiry. The inquiry needs to be on were there cover-ups? Was there accountability for those people in positions of authority who should have dealt with this? And that, I think, is why we need
And you think that can only be done with a national inquiry?
And one of the values of it, by the way, just to add, but one of the values of it is that it can that kind of inquiry can transform not just institutions but an entire culture. If you look at the Catholic Church, my church, so we're talking about faith and its relationship to abuse, there's been a lot of child abuse within my church. The church, through the process of confronting it, imperfectly, still going on, but it has confronted it, it has had inquiries, it has been transformed. The church is a very, very different place to what it was before. Attitudes among believers towards authority and hierarchy have been radically transformed. Do we really believe that has happened since the grooming cases? No.
the other thing that is absolutely essential about this inquiry is it needs to be locally led by an independent person. So it needs the Home Office's statutory authority to mandate people to come forward, but it needs to have local ownership, and the victims and survivors need to be right at the centre of designing that locally.
You've written this piece. Why? We'll just show the headline, the Daily Telegraph. Islam is not to blame for the grooming gangs. A healthy civilization acknowledges the capacity of man to be evil and mitigates it.
Well, this is my semi-annual plea for religious tolerance, which always goes down really badly among small C conservatives, but what the hell,
try again.
I'll do it. I do it partly because of a personal affection for Islam, for religion, and for the multi-faith, multicultural society. I'm a cosmopolitan. I like the mix of religions in our country. And I fear sometimes that if we do, some people have instinctively latched onto, well, this is an Islam thing, isn't it? Well, I think aside from that being inaccurate, and I argue in the column as to why I think that's inaccurate, it also distracts us from the point that this is an evil which anyone can do under any conditions. And the problem with saying this is specifically an Islam thing, or this is specifically a male Pakistani thing, is you have the problem of France. While we're discussing this, 51 men have been convicted of raping an unconscious housewife. They were all backgrounds, all creeds and colours, all ages, all classes. How do you explain that? What it teaches us is that, tragically, a lot of people are capable of doing terrible things under certain circumstances. And if society blames specific things, by focusing on that specific thing, it forgets the general point, which is that we have to be on guard. We have to be culturally on guard against the potential of man to do terrible, terrible things. And we have to shape our society in such a way as to mitigate against that and reduce the possibility of that. And if we go down the route, which I fear some on my side of the politics will do, of saying, can we now please talk about the evils of Islam? Not only do I think that's inaccurate, but it will be misleading, because this is something which happens in all societies, among all peoples and at all times.
Is there a worry that that could happen on your side of the political spectrum?
I think that's always a worry. I agree with everything you've just said. The people in Well, a lot of the people in my party who could put forward those arguments have probably left my party and gone to Reform, because that's a different outlook.
Yeah.
The really important word that you used just now is tolerance. And that's what we really need to rely upon and to grow. That we've got used to the idea that different parts of the Christian church can get on perfectly well together. So do decent, honest worshippers of Islam. In my former constituency, we have councillors elected and a really good social life amongst every single religion you can mention, every single one, and everyone gets on really well together because they have one aim, which is the good of our local community, and it works really well. I don't even know who actually practices which religion, or any or none.
Well, then can I get you to respond to remarks made on the programme yesterday by Saqib Bhatti, Conservative MP, the Shadow front bench, to do with language and words used by the Shadow Justice Secretary, Robert Jenrick, when he said that the scandal that we're talking about of grooming gangs started with the onset of mass migration, importing hundreds of thousands of people from alien cultures who possess medieval attitudes towards women brought us here. Now, I asked Saqib Bhatti whether he felt comfortable with Robert Jenrick's language, and he said, as a British Pakistani male, I can tell you that is not the kind of language I would use. What would you say?
It's not the kind of language I've ever used. But
should Robert Jenrick take it back?
But the fact is, no, I think he was illustrating a point, and let's face it, by saying what he said, he has drawn attention to the issue, and the issue needs to be properly examined, and that's actually the point.
All right.
Can I just say, these people are paedophiles. Let's deal with them as paedophiles. Let's use the law to prevent it. Let's use everything we've got to protect the children. That's what we ought to be focusing on.
We've got a few minutes until Prime Minister's questions. Let's have a look inside the chamber. It has been filling up, as you would expect. There we go. As I say, only 2 minutes or so until Keir Starmer faces questions from Kemi Badenoch. Yesterday, or overnight, we heard that the Economic Secretary to the Treasury, Tulip Siddiq, resigned from the government after referring herself to the Prime Minister's standard advisor, Sir Lawrie Magnus. Now, it was about questions relating to her aunt, the former Prime Minister of Bangladesh. And Tulip Siddiq was named, we can see her here, very close ally of Keir Starmer. They have neighbouring constituencies. She was named in a corruption investigation in Bangladesh, and she was the anti-corruption minister as part of the Treasury. Embarrassing and awkward for the Prime Minister, but how much of a blow to his judgment should she ever have been put in as Cities Minister?
I think this is really sad, because both as a shadow minister and as a minister, Tulip has been absolutely fantastic, and you know, we can't choose our families and what they do, so I have a great deal of sympathy for her. However, when the press start going and digging on something like this, they don't let go, and I think she was right to step down, because it was a distraction. However, had she been in a different job, if she'd been flood minister, for example, I'm not sure the press would have been quite so voraciously going for her.
Well, that is then the judgment question about Keir Starmer. I think we can show you a little bit of the letter from Sir Lawrie Magnus. I might need my glasses for this, because he says that she didn't breach the ministerial code. He was looking at whether she had breached the ministerial code. But he does say it's regrettable that she wasn't more alert to the potential reputational risks, both to her and the government, arising from her close family's association with Bangladesh. I would not advise that this shortcoming should be taken as a breach of the ministerial code, but you will want to consider her ongoing responsibilities in light of this. As I say, perhaps she should never have been given that role, bearing in mind a potential, something she denies, of any sort of conflict of interest.
Well, remember that this has only recently come into the press, and it's being used a lot in Bangladesh for political reasons. So at the time, I guess the decision was made. I don't have whatever a reverse crystal ball is to see what the discussions were about that.
Eleanor, it's been a while since we've had you in the studio, of course, for understandable reasons. I think since 2013 yes. You were Deputy Speaker until recently, and now you've been liberated, I suppose, in,
yes, in
one form of another. What's your view of the new Parliament? It looks very different. More Green MPs, a lot more Liberal Democrat MPs, and, of course, a much smaller Conservative party.
It's very, very different, and every parliament is different from every other parliament, but this one is dramatically different from the last parliament, and one of the reasons is the mix of people on the opposition benches. I noticed last week there were only maybe 2 Conservatives speaking in Prime Minister's questions, and I wondered what had gone wrong. Nothing had gone wrong when I looked at the statistics. The fact is that there are lots more opposition parties. There are also an awful lot of people on the government backbenches, and you know that's going to be a big problem for the Prime Minister in the long run. It's great having a huge majority, but it's really difficult to manage all those backbenches.
Well, let's hear from the Prime Minister.
With questions to Prime Minister Joshua Reynolds.
Yes. Question 1, Mr. Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know members across the House will want to extend our thanks to President Biden for his steadfast leadership and warmly congratulate President-elect Trump ahead of his inauguration. Mr. Speaker, in my conversation with President-elect Trump, we've underlined our shared commitment to the special relationship in the years to come. Mr. Speaker, this week we launched our AI Opportunities Action Plan, which will ensure we seize the opportunities of AI to benefit working people as part of our plan for change. That will boost productivity, transform public services, deliver £39 billion of investment and over 13,000 jobs. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Joshua Reynolds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With almost 4.5 million entries and exits in the last year, Maidenhead train station is a busy transport hub. But with crowded gate lines, flooded underpasses and a drop-off facility that isn't fit for purpose, the station needs major upgrades to give Maidenhead commuters what they deserve. So does the Prime Minister understand how Maidenhead residents face at the station? And will he commit his government to fixing these issues in this government?
Prime Minister.
Well, thank him for his question, and I'm pleased that his constituents are benefiting from the upgrades at the station, including, I think, new lifts to make the station fully accessible. The issues he raises are faced by passengers right across the country, and that is why we're bringing rail services back into public ownership, setting up Great British Railways and making ticketing simpler and fairer to ensure a better service for all passengers, including in his constituency.
Lashana Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I recently visited Mid-Kent College, which serves my constituency of Gillingham and Rainham, and where valuable construction skills are taught to young people. However, I was also informed that the college faces significant challenges in recruiting teachers to deliver those courses. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that proper skills training and having the teachers necessary to deliver it is absolutely vital to growing our economy and building the homes we need for the future? And will he agree to set up a meeting with the relevant minister to discuss the recruitment challenges that some colleges face?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, skilling up the next generation is, of course, vital to kick-starting economic growth. And our plan for change will rebuild Britain by delivering 1.5 million new homes. That's why we've established Skills England, reforming our planning system and training the workforce. And I will ensure that she gets the meeting that she wants with the relevant minister.
Becomes the Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Beryl.
Mr. Speaker, on Friday, while borrowing costs hit levels not seen since Labour was last in government, I met business owners and their employees in Chesterfield. One of them told me that his business will not exist in 4 years' time because of this government's policies. It might not even exist next year. The Prime Minister may try to blame his inheritance or blame global factors, but why should anyone trust a word he says over the businesses who are saying again and again that his budget means fewer jobs, lower growth and higher borrowing costs?
Mr. Speaker, as she knows, the global economy is experiencing volatility and higher borrowing costs. That is why it was vital that we took the tough and right decisions in the budget to get our finances back in order. We had to deal with the £22 billion black hole that they left. We made difficult cuts, raised taxes to invest in health, public services and housing, vital to stability, vital to growth. And we've got an ironclad commitment to our fiscal rules. And she will welcome, no doubt, the inflation figures from this morning. But contrast that with the party opposite. They weren't brave enough in government to take those difficult decisions. They've opposed all of our measures to stabilise the economy and promote growth. They're back to the magic money tree. She wants all the benefits of the budget, but she can't say how she's going to pay for them. They haven't changed. They're still economic vandals and fantasists. Imagine where we'd be if they were still in charge.
Mr. Speaker, just today, the British Retail Consortium says 2/3 of businesses will have to raise prices to cope with his tax hike. His Chancellor ignored all the warnings and ploughed ahead with an unprecedented borrowing spree, leaving all of us more vulnerable. Now we have businesses saying they will raise prices to cover his jobs tax. We have an energy policy that will drive up bills, and all the while we are spending more day to day on debt interest than we do on schools and universities. The Prime Minister refused to repeat his Chancellor's promise that she wouldn't come back for more. Will he now rule out any new tax rises this year?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we took the right and difficult decisions at the budget. Decisions that they did not have the courage to take, which left us in the mess in the first place. When it comes to tax, she knows very well the limits of what I can say from this dispatch box, but we have an ironclad commitment to our fiscal rules. We can't just tax our way out of the problems that they left us, which is why we put in place tough. They were howling at the spending decisions. They wouldn't take them, and we'll stick to those spending decisions, and our focus is absolutely on growth. But their record, they flatlined the economy. They flatlined the economy. A mini-budget that crashed the economy, worst cost of living crisis in living history, and they left a £22 billion black hole. Not taking lessons from them on the economy.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister knows very well the OBR found no such black hole. And he talks about a budget 3 years ago. The borrowing costs last week are at a 27-year high for 30-year gilts. The Chancellor is apparently promising to be ruthless in reducing spending. Let me suggest something that he should cut. There is no way that we should be giving up British territory in Chagos. He is rushing a deal which will be disastrous and which will land taxpayers with a multi-billion-pound bill. Why does the Prime Minister think British people should pay to surrender something that is already ours?
Mr. Speaker, we inherited a situation where the long-term operation of a vital military base was under threat because of legal challenges. The negotiations were started under the last government. The then Foreign Secretary came to this House to say why he was starting negotiations and what he wanted to achieve. And he said the aim was, to quote, ensure the continued effective operation of the base. That is precisely what this deal has delivered.
Mr. Speaker, there is no one he can blame for this dud deal except himself. At the budget, Labour were congratulating themselves for having the first female Chancellor, instead of ensuring the country had someone actually qualified to do the job. The Prime Minister...
I want to hear... Sorry. I want to hear the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister claims he has full confidence in the Chancellor, but the markets clearly do not. Yesterday, the Chancellor repeated her promise to have just one budget per year to provide businesses with certainty. The talk in the City is that she can't meet her fiscal rules, and there will need to be an emergency budget. So does the Prime Minister stand by the Chancellor's commitment that there will be only one budget this year?
Prime Minister.
She'll be pleased to know the Chancellor will be in place for many, many years to come. She'll outstrip them. Mr. Speaker, if we all thought the politics was about cheap points, I could criticise their chancellors, but I don't have enough time to go through all of the chancellors that they had. We have one budget, that's what we're committed to, strong fiscal rules, and we'll stick to them, unlike the party opposite.
Mr. Speaker, at a time of turmoil in the markets, the Prime Minister was distracted by the crisis around the former City Minister. What does it tell us about his judgment that yesterday he said he was saddened that his close friend resigned? This was an anti-corruption minister under criminal investigation for corruption. Mohammed Yunus, the Nobel Prize winner advising Bangladesh, said London properties gifted to the former City Minister may be proceeds of robbery. So, will the Prime Minister offer Bangladesh the full support of our National Crime Agency in ensuring that any properties bought with stolen funds are properly investigated?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the former City Minister referred herself the independent advisor. He found, as she well knows, there was no breach of the code. He knows that he found there was no wrongdoing, and the former minister fully cooperated. She referred herself a week ago Monday. I got the report yesterday, and she resigned yesterday afternoon. Compare that with the Shadow Foreign Secretary, who breached the ministerial code. Her predecessor, Batu, ignored it. It was the advisor that then had to resign because he wasn't taken seriously, and she's now serving the leader of the opposition. What a contrast. Thank God the British public chucked them out.
Mr. Speaker, he did not answer the question about the National Crime Agency. No answer to investigating dodgy Labour ministers, just as last week he didn't want an inquiry that might expose dodgy Labour councils. The Prime Minister knowingly appointed a convicted fraudster as his Transport Secretary. The anti-corruption minister he had full confidence in only days ago resigned yesterday in disgrace. He is negotiating a secret deal to surrender British territory, and taxpayers in this country will pay for the humiliation. Now it turns out his government may write a cheque to compensate Jerry Adams. This is shameful. We left him the fastest growing economy in the G7. In just 6 months, under his leadership, it's been taxes up, borrowing up, mortgage rates up, and that's not all. Business confidence is down, jobs are down, growth is down. Can the country afford 4 more years of his terrible judgments?
Mr. Speaker, among that barrage of complete nonsense, there is one point that I need to address, because it's the Legacy Act, and it will be of real interest across the House. That Act was unfit because, well, not least because it gave immunity to hundreds of terrorists and wasn't supported by victims in Northern Ireland, nor, I believe, by any of the political parties in Northern Ireland. The court found it unlawful. We will put in place this is a serious point. We will put in place a better framework. We're working on a draft remedial order and replacement legislation, and we will look at every conceivable way to prevent these types of cases claiming damages. And it's important I say that on the record. But as for her claim and her nonsense, they crashed the economy. Mr. Speaker, I got a letter this week from a Tory voter in a Labour seat. I hope they don't mind me saying who it was. It was Liz Truss. Mr. Speaker, it wasn't written in green ink, but it might as well have been. She was complaining that saying she'd crashed the economy was damaging her reputation. It was actually crashing the economy that damaged her reputation. Mr. Speaker, what have we heard? All they've got is complaining. No defence for their sorry record. They don't even acknowledge it. No ideas, no policy. They're like a blank piece of paper, blowing hopelessly in the wind. No wonder the country put them in the bin.
Jim Dixon. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Patients in Kent are experiencing a winter crisis resulting from years of underinvestment in our NHS. Many are having to be treated on trolleys in corridors with cases of winter flu and other viruses, providing a significant challenge to local health services. What assurance can the Prime Minister offer my residents in Dartford that the reforms and extra investment set out by the Secretary of State for Health will make this inadequate care a thing of the past, and would he visit Darrant Valley Hospital in Dartford with me?
Prime Minister. Well, I thank him for raising this, and I'm deeply sorry for those receiving inadequate care in his constituency. The last government left the NHS in a critical condition, and you can't deliver growth with record waiting lists, 2.8 economically inactive. Our plan for change, investing in the NHS, diagnostic centres, and I will, of course, consider his invitation.
Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I echo the words of the Prime Minister about President Trump, and hope both his team and the team of President-elect Biden can work together to bring President-elect Trump and President Biden can work together to bring the peace in Gaza we so desperately need, so the hostages can be released, we can get the aid in, and the killing can stop. Mr. Speaker, as the Honourable Member for Dartford just said, patients are suffering through the worst NHS winter crisis on record. Last month alone, 54,000 people waited more than 12 hours in A&E. Over 63,000 were stuck in ambulances for over an hour before they could even get into hospital. So there's no doubt the flu season has made the winter crisis worse. But we see these winter crises year after years of neglect of the NHS by the Conservatives. NHS leaders say we will never put an end to these winter crises unless we fix the crisis in social care. Now, I asked him this question last week and I was disappointed in his replies. I'm going to try again. Will he scrap the 3-year timetable he's given to the Casey Commission so he can fix social care this year and implement the reforms by the end of this year at the latest?
Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, on the talks towards a ceasefire, we are encouraged by the talks. I think the whole House would urge all to come to an agreement and have the hostages released. We all understand the absolute torture that their families are going through every single minute, every single day that this continues. So we hope that there can be progress there. In relation to the NHS, he's absolutely right. The party opposite left it on its knees. There's no point groaning. It is absolutely disgraceful that the NHS was left in the state that it was in. Absolutely disgraceful. We are investing to turn that around. We are reforming to turn that around. We are within that reform dealing with social care. I set out the timetable to him last week in the way that he knows it's set out.
Sir Ed Davis. Speaker, I'm continually disappointed by the Prime Minister's position on social care, and I'm going to keep coming back to this issue because unless we fix it, we won't fix the NHS. But turning now to the economy, an idea for the Chancellor to grow the economy. As President-elect Trump prepares to take office next week, there are reports that a number of wealthy, high-skilled Americans are looking to come to the UK for fear of what President-elect Trump will do to their country. But because the Conservatives so broke the immigration system, many of them are finding there's no visa that they can apply for. Now, I know the Prime Minister is rightly seeking to reduce immigration from the record highs of the Conservative. But does he agree, if people like this want to come to our country, to bring their money and their skills so we can grow our economy and pay for our public services, they should be able to?
Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, we welcome all investment into the United Kingdom, and I'm very pleased we've had record investment in the time that we've been in office and continue to welcome investors and investment to this country. But he's absolutely right. The last government lost control of immigration as they lost control of health and the economy and the borders and everything else. And it was, of course, the Leader of the Opposition who was championing the driving up of the numbers. So we will bring those numbers down. We'll get it back under control. We'll encourage investment.
Christine Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Dental deserts mean that routine dental checkups and treatment is often unavailable in local communities. In my constituency, we've had a dedicated space for dental practice in the Blackburn Partnership Centre since 2018, but NHS Lothian has been unable to secure a dental practice. What steps will the Prime Minister take to work with devolved governments to improve access to local NHS dentists across the UK?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank you for raising this issue, and it shows the state of public services under the SNP. Mr. Speaker, if you can believe it, a third of Scots struggle to access dentistry, and a quarter of Scottish children start primary school with tooth decay. That is really shocking. Clearly, there's much more the SNP should be doing. They should be ashamed. When a quarter of children are starting school with tooth decay, that is nothing to crow about. It's something to be ashamed of. Mr. Speaker, here we're delivering additional 700,000 appointments, reforming the contracts, and of course we'll work with the Scottish Government to improve the health of children in Scotland.
Jim Allister.
Given President Trump's antipathy to the EU, how does the Prime Minister hope to attain a trade deal for the whole United Kingdom in circumstances where the trade laws affecting part of the United Kingdom, namely Northern Ireland, are the EU's trade laws, and in circumstances where the laws governing goods and the standards of those that can be imported are EU laws? How, in those circumstances, can a deal be obtained for the whole United Kingdom Or is the Prime Minister only interested in a deal which would apply to GB and thereby further ostracise Northern Ireland from the Union?
Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, the honourable member knows that controls apply only to EU goods moving into Great Britain. The overwhelming majority of goods moving between Northern Ireland and Great Britain will continue to enjoy unfettered access to Great Britain indefinitely. The honourable member's made much of mutual enforcement. The reality is this is mutual agreement, and I know he's got his proposal, but I think his proposal would lead in the end to a hard border, and that's something that has been rejected across this House on many, many occasions, and for good reason.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. In the general election campaign, Labour leadership promised that if we won, we would step in and save the Grangemouth refinery, retain those jobs and invest in its future. 6 months later, this hasn't happened yet. If the refinery closes, then thousands of jobs will be lost and Scotland's national security will become massively weaker. Now that we are in power, I know that the government should use it to intervene and save the refinery jobs, protect Scotland and deliver on the promise to build Grangemouth for the future. Will the Prime Minister do that?
This is a really important point, Mr Speaker, because before July there was no plan at all to support the workers at Grangemouth. Within weeks, and importantly, we announced a £100 million deal for a growth deal, and we're jointly funding Project Willow to find a viable long-term future. It is a really serious point. I take it very seriously, and we'll do everything we can to make sure that viable long-term future is there for the workers, for their communities, and all that rely on it.
Dr. Danny Chambers.
Mr Speaker, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has led to the emergence of bacteria that are severely resistant to multiple antibiotics, and this is now seriously delaying the return of injured soldiers back to the front line. But just like Mr Putin, we know that these superbugs do not respect national borders, and it is only a matter of time until we start to detect them in our NHS hospitals, and we know that antimicrobial resistance is a huge challenge facing us at the moment. Will the Prime Minister consider supporting the Ukrainian war effort by providing rapid diagnostic tests which can be used in the field and in civilian hospitals, which would not only enable us to diagnose and treat these resistant infections more quickly, returning soldiers back to the front line more quickly, but will also provide valuable surveillance data to help global public health and protect our NHS from these dangerous bacteria?
I thank him for raising this, and he knows our support for Ukraine is ironclad. Mr Speaker, we are funding NHS doctors and nurses to work closely with their Ukrainian counterparts to share best practice, including how to prevent the spread of infections and AMR. Through the World Health Organization, we're also strengthening Ukraine's health system to provide better care, and we'll continue to do so.
Andy MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Employment Rights Bill is urgently needed, especially given the exploitation of gig workers, like those retail assistants employed through apps, with vital rights denied and staff being charged a premium should they want to be paid on time. Insecure work denies workers their rights, but the TUC has also said it costs the economy around £10 billion a year. So will the Prime Minister agree with me that having a single status of worker will help end such abusive practices, give workers security and significantly benefit the economy?
I thank him for raising this, and Mr Speaker, I believe everyone is entitled to fair, flexible and secure working, and that's why we introduced our Employment Rights Bill, which is the biggest upgrade to workers' rights in a generation. It includes measures that will end the scandal of fire and rehire, preventing exploitative zero-hour contracts and introducing basic rights for more workers from day one, secure wages, secure jobs and ensuring workers have the rights that they deserve at work.
Peter Bedford.
you, Mr. Speaker. Age UK Leicestershire have done a sterling job over the last few months, supporting pensioners who have lost the winter fuel payment as a result of his government's budget. They now face a staggering £400,000 increase in their costs as a result of the increase in national insurance. What advice can the Prime Minister give to charities like Age UK, who now have to decide whether to cut jobs or slash services to some of the most vulnerable in society?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the advantage, I suppose, of the Leader of the Opposition having no policies is that they can say completely contradictory things without breaching their policy. But they want the benefits of the budget, but none of the tough measures to support the budget. We have, Mr. Speaker, we've taken the decision in relation to pension credit and pension allowances, but because of our commitment to the triple lock, there will be an upgrade in April of this year of £460. But, Mr. Speaker, what I noticed that before Christmas, the Shadow Chancellor said that the triple lock is unsustainable. Unsustainable. So that's their position. Pensions going up under this government because committing to the triple lock unsustainable is their argument.
Graham Morris.
Later this month, will mark the anniversary of the tragic murder of Holly Newton. Will the Prime Minister and Home Secretary look urgently at the calls from Holly's mother, Michaela Trusser, to lower the age that a person can be recognised as a victim of domestic abuse?
Prime Minister.
Can I thank the honourable member for raising this tragic case? And it is a really important issue. We've seen an increase in violence in teenage relationships in the last decade. And, Mr. Speaker, I've been continually shocked by research that shows that at a younger and younger age, there's abuse in relationships. So we do need to look at this at the earliest opportunity to how we properly protect girls. But I'm very grateful that this tragic case has been raised.
Bennebeast Jack.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since becoming a Labour leader, has the Prime Minister ever discussed or communicated with Philippe Sands KC about the Chagos Islands?
Yes, No. Prime Minister. I'll get him in. I'll get you in, yeah. Right. Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. York is an incredible city, but demands on tourist destinations like York, where we received over 9 million visitors and 1.7 million overnight stays, places significant pressure on local public services and housing used as short-term holiday lets. What steps will the Prime Minister take to equip local authorities to better balance the benefits of tourism with the additional costs to our communities?
Well, Mr. Speaker, tourism is vital to our economy, and particularly in cities like York. Places can already choose to introduce a voluntary levy on overnight stays. Our focus is supporting industry, including by providing a 40% relief for retail, hospitality and leisure properties, and permanently lowering their rates from next April.
Matt Vickers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Margaret from Stockton is furious. Stockton's Labour Council are axing her weekly bin collection, scrapping free high street parking and closing her local recycling centre, all while employing a ridiculous number of people on £100,000 salaries. But she's even more furious because they're taking on another one. Behind closed doors, probably in a darkened room, they've created a new interim role for the managing director's best mate on £900 a day. It's never been approved by the council. It's never been advertised as a job. Margaret's right to be angry, isn't she, Prime Minister?
Mr. Speaker, I'm sure Margaret would be very pleased to see the incredible investment that's going in to the area, the 4,000 jobs which is growing the economy. The state of our local councils was left completely damaged after the last government. She knows that. Everybody knows that.
Graham Morris.
Thanks. You never have too many Morrises. To its credit, in its first budget, this Labour government transferred the Mine Workers Pension Scheme Investment Reserve Fund, benefiting nearly 4,000 former miners and miners' widows in my Eisen constituency. However, almost 700 British Coal Staff Superannuation Scheme pensioners in my constituency were excluded. Will the Prime Minister correct this injustice and ensure BC SSS beneficiaries, many now elderly and in very poor health, are treated equally to their co-workers in the MPS?
Prime Minister.
Can I thank him for his dedicated campaigning on this issue? I am proud that this government has overturned a historic injustice, boosting the pensions of over 100,000 former mine workers. We are, Mr Speaker, working closely with the coal staff trustees to consider their proposal, and I'll ensure the Industry Minister keeps him fully updated.
Joe Roberts.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My constituents on the Isle of Wight are entirely reliant on foreign-owned, debt-laden, unregulated ferry companies for essential travel. But in the United Kingdom, public transport is regulated and subsidised, like buses, trains, Scottish ferries. Does the Prime Minister agree with me this Isle of Wight anomaly must come to an end? And will the government intervene in order to protect passengers from excessive ferry prices and bad services?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him for raising this, and he's right. The ferry services for his constituents have simply not been good enough, and I know that both he and my honourable friend, the member for the Isle of Wight West, share a commitment to ensuring their constituents receive a better service. The Maritime Minister has met the ferry and hovercraft operators, the leader of the Council and other stakeholders. There will be further meetings, and I'll make sure that he is fully informed by the Minister of the progress on this issue for his constituents.
Patricia Ferguson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. This year marks the 850th anniversary of my home city of Glasgow. One of the key aims of the celebration is to speed up ambitions around the City Council's grand challenge of tackling poverty and inequality and of increasing prosperity and opportunity, themes that chime very clearly with this government's agenda too. So will the Prime Minister join with me in congratulating Glasgow on this milestone, and does he agree with me that people really do make Glasgow?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank you for raising this. Glasgow's a great city, and I'm very happy to join with her in congratulating the people of Glasgow on the 850th anniversary. They have made and will continue to make a huge contribution to this country.
Jack Rankin.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Today marks 467 days in captivity for Avinatan Or, just one of the over 100 hostages Hamas still cruelly hold. Avinatan is my age. He has his whole life ahead of him. I felt the raw pain of his family when his mum, Ditsa, a British citizen, shared her story with me as part of the Twin a Hostage campaign. Can the Prime Minister assure me he's doing everything in his power to ensure all the hostages are returned, so Avinatan can be at home where he belongs with Ditsa and his girlfriend, Noah?
Prime Minister.
I thank him for raising this case. It's appalling that Hamas continue to detain Avinatan and other hostages, including Emily Damari, and I know he's spent time with the families, and it is nothing short of torture what they are going through, and we will do absolutely everything in our power to ensure that we make progress in bringing these hostages home, and I'm sure I speak for everybody in the House, but we will do everything to try and make sure that we get those hostages home.
Final question, Jonathan Brash.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My constituent, Richard Lee, has waited over 43 years for answers about the disappearance of his daughter, Catrice, from a military base in Germany in 1981. She was just 2 years old. The Royal Military Police, the MOD and successive governments have failed to get answers that he deserves, throwing up barrier after barrier to justice. Will the Prime Minister agree to meet with Richard and myself to finally give this Hartlepool veteran a way forward to uncover the truth about the disappearance of his daughter?
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank him for raising this deeply distressing case, and our thoughts and sympathies are obviously with Richard Lee and his family. The Defence Serious Crime Unit, Mr Speaker, continue to appeal for new evidence in this case, and I will make sure that he has a meeting with the appropriate minister to discuss progress. Thank you.
That completes Prime Minister's questions.
That brings us to the end of this week's PMQs, as you heard there from the Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle. Let's introduce our guest for this part of Politics Live. For the Government, the Trade Minister, Douglas Alexander, and for the Conservatives, Gareth Davis, a Shadow Treasury Minister. Welcome to both of you, and the BBC's Deputy Political Editor, Vicki Young. Kemi Badenoch's questions. Well, she covered quite a lot of different issues, although the theme broadly seemed to be about spending decisions that are being made in relation to the focus and spotlight there has been on the economy and the continued fallout from Rachel Reeves's budget. What did you make of it, Vicki?
Yeah, I mean, you could say it was a scattergun approach. On the other hand, you could say, well, there was an awful lot that she had to go at there, given what's been going on. And the main bulk of it was really about those budget decisions. And I think what you can see happening here is, as you would expect, a blame game. The Labour government obviously saying this is the legacy of the Conservatives, economic mismanagement. And I think what you can see Kemi Badenoch trying to do is to say, actually, look, this isn't about global headwinds or other issues. This is about decisions you've made. So putting up business taxes, for example, giving examples there of people and businesses saying they're going to put up prices, saying that this is feeding inflation. But as you say, she then moved on to various other issues, the Chagos Island, saying that's going to be expensive and that's going to be a bad deal. She talked about Tulip Siddiq, the Treasury Minister, who's had to resign, saying that's about Keir Starmer's judgment. So she is trying to pin it on him when it comes to his judgment in the decisions that he has made.
Well, bring us up to date in terms of the resignation of the now former Treasury Minister Tulip Siddiq, because she had been under some pressure for a bit of time, referring herself to the Ministerial Standards Commissioner, Sir Laurie Magnus, and this is because she was named in a corruption investigation in Bangladesh where her aunt was the former Prime Minister and she was deposed last year. But in the end, she resigned, using that famous phrase, because she'd become a distraction for the government. What did Sir Laurie Magnus find?
Yeah, I mean, it was a very quick report, and that is very different to some of the ones we saw under the Conservatives. I think it was, maybe a week or so, and really there was no genuine suggestion that he was going to get to the bottom of what is a very murky and complicated story that various journalists have been looking into actually for years. So the idea that he could get to the bottom of this in that time, I think, was never going to happen. What he did say is that there was no evidence that she broke the ministerial code, but there are so many questions still to be answered, particularly about the previous ownership of properties in London, which Tulip Siddiq now benefits from. And she couldn't answer all of those questions, and we still don't know. She had this property transferred to her. She said she thought it was from her parents. We still don't know how that ownership came to her and who from. And of course, the fact that her aunt has been tied up in all of this, these allegations of corruption, and the fact that her job title had in it anti-corruption minister certainly didn't help the case. And I think it was definitely becoming a distraction. And in the end, I think they probably decided, look, it was better that she went. But he's left the door open, Keir Starmer, for her return.
Yes. I mean, Douglas Alexander, do we need to get to the bottom of what's been going on in terms of properties that certainly Tulip Siddiq thought were gifted to her by her parents? Do we need to know exactly what happened?
Well, she's resigned from the government, and as you say, by historic standards, it was fairly quick in the sense that she referred herself to the independent ethics advisor last week. We had instantly strengthened and made more independent Laurie Magnus on coming to office. So, if you like, this is an example of where the system has actually operated relatively expeditiously, with the result that he said the ministerial code has not been broken, but that I think there was phraseology around she could have been more alive to the reputational risks. In terms of
it wasn't without criticism,
was it?
I
mean, what the Bangladeshi authorities do, that's frankly and respectfully a matter for the Bangladeshi authorities. But in that sense, she has now left the government. Frankly, having served in government previously, these things happen.
Right. I mean, how much of a blow, though? I mean, we were showing pictures. They're very close political friends, Tulip Siddiq and the Prime Minister, neighbouring constituencies. They entered Parliament at the same time. It's the second minister to have to go in just 6 months. It's pretty disappointing, isn't it, from a government, especially when it's all about potential reputational damage.
Actually, what Tulip did yesterday was to recognise the reputational jeopardy and resign. That's very different, frankly, as the Prime Minister himself pointed out, from, let's say, the Shadow Foreign Secretary and her conduct in relation to the ministerial code under the previous government. My broad observation on this is, of course it's disappointing, I'm not pretending otherwise, But it was wholly incredible for Kemi Badenoch to try and score political points on this, given the kind of howling moral vacuum that we saw under the last Conservative government in relation to standards and propriety.
Oh, a howling moral vacuum. Not easy for you to say. Gareth, I mean, there is hypocrisy here, isn't there, from the Conservatives and the Tories? This system is working as it should. She's gone.
I think most people would try and understand how you can receive properties for free, not know who's giving them to you when you've signed the land registry, and how you can stay in a position where you're effectively the anti-corruption minister being accused of corruption. It is kind of strange, and I can't believe we're even having this discussion, to be honest.
Right, well, she's gone, but she's gone. She was named in a corruption investigation. I mean, she denies any claims of corruption herself, but she's gone. I mean, doesn't that just show that having an independent assessment of ministerial standards is working? Priti Patel, who Douglas Alexander is referring to, was sitting there on the front bench next to Kemi Badenoch, was actually found to have breached the ministerial code in the past, but Boris Johnson decided that was all right and he'd keep her.
Well, it's the Labour playbook to try and talk about everybody else other than themselves. They have to take responsibility for what's actually happening now. And in just 6 months, they've lost a Transport Secretary, a Downing Street Chief of Staff, and now a Treasury Minister, all because of scandals. I think, you know, they need to start taking responsibility for themselves and then recognise the fact that they are now in office in government.
Right. Well, do you want to take responsibility, Douglas?
Frankly, the two ministers in question take responsibility. I'd rather struggle to remember the scandal in relation to Sue Gray. Do you want to share?
But I have to say, there's a pattern.
What was it? You've just made that allegation.
I didn't.
What was the scandal?
Well, you
said
tell
all
me.
three.
I don't know. Why did she go?
One.
Why did she go?
This is what we've seen for the
Clearly
last
wasn't
half hour.
that bad enough because she ended up in the House of Lords. So maybe it wasn't. But I think there's a pattern.
Please don't just make things up.
I think there's a pattern
because
here.
that's what we've just seen from the leader of the opposition.
I think
which
there's a
is
pattern here.
A leader of the opposition wandering around opportunistically, trying to find an angle, trying to find a headline.
Well, look, just on this, if I may.
Her job is to be a credible.
Well, let him speak.
She is an incredible and a credible leader. Her job is to scrutinise the government. I know you laugh it off, but it's an actual role to be the official opposition. And some may say she is needed more than ever because where was the scrutiny on the Transport Secretary? Where was the scrutiny on the anti-corruption minister that has led us to a position where 2 senior ministers have had to resign in 6 months? It's humiliating. She is doing her job to scrutinise this government. But I have to say, there's a pattern here. It all leads back to one person. One person appointed these people, and that was the Prime Minister. What does it say about his judgment and who's going to be next? Rachel Reeves?
So I'd observe, listen, the Prime Minister's question does involve the scrutiny of the government, and I welcome that. That's a key part of our democratic system. But the truth is it tests the leader of the opposition as well. Jo was very polite in suggesting, I think it was a scattergun approach. The fact is, if you don't have any policy and you try and make a virtue of having no policy, if you've got a horrendous legacy in terms of the fiscal position that we'll come on to discuss, or indeed public services that the Liberal Democrat leader was discussing, at some point you have to accept responsibility for the record that saw you thrown out of office. And until there is some humility, some account for what happened in those 14 years, I'm afraid we'll continue to see Kemi Badenoch ask questions, but the British public simply won't give them a hearing.
Right, well, let's talk about the economy, because Keir Starmer talked about making the right and difficult decisions when it comes to the financial situation. He also said that the Chancellor will be ruthless about reducing spending, or certainly on what is being spent in the public purse. Is that going to mean spending cuts, Douglas Alexander, and particularly to welfare?
Well, listen, I'm a Trade Minister, not the Treasury Minister. We don't anticipate future fiscal events. We're waiting, all of us, for the OBR forecast that's due in March. But what the Prime Minister reiterated today, Rachel said in the Chamber yesterday, was the markets and indeed the public should have no doubt that we are determined to meet our fiscal rules and will act accordingly.
OK, and your fiscal rules are that you aren't going to borrow for day-to-day spending. You'll balance the books. You're going to borrow to invest. Kemi Badenoch quoted the £100 billion or so borrowing that may well have led to some spook in the markets. But I come back again. If you're going to stick to those fiscal rules, will you have to make... I mean, if the figures don't add up, you're not going to put up taxes, we've heard that. Will you look at spending cuts to welfare and other parts of the public service?
You're inviting me to speculate on a forecast that we have not yet received in the service of rules that we've set out. What I can assure you today is we will adhere to those rules. But I'm not going to write future tax policy or future spending policy, with great respect, in this studio at this juncture. Let's wait and see what the OBR forecast says in March. But be clear, we are absolutely committed to meeting those fiscal rules.
Are you committed, then, in the way the government has said already, that the Chancellor will not be coming back for more tax rises like the ones that she announced in the budget on business in October?
Well, there was an immediate and particular challenge, which was the need to do two things. First of all, fill the black hole, the £22 billion black hole that was left for us.
The OBR only said was about £9 billion.
And secure an immediate injection of about £20 billion into public services, the reason that the Liberal Democrats were asking their question today. Those circumstances were particular to what we inherited on coming into office. But of course, the Chancellor has the right and indeed the responsibility to continue to meet those fiscal rules as we move forward.
Well, Gareth, then what is the problem? If you believe that the OBR that said there was certainly a £9 billion black hole, the rest has been disputed by the government and the Conservatives, there isn't a fiscal event actually scheduled until later on this year. Would you welcome cuts in spending rather than tax rises if that's what happens?
Well, look, the first thing to say is the Chancellor has, I'm afraid, boxed herself in quite spectacularly. On the one hand, she says she's not going to increase taxes. She's made that clear at the CBI. On the other hand, she's accused us of austerity and, not being responsible with the public finances. And yet, borrowing costs have gone up such an amount that her fiscal rules, as if they were executed today, they would be broken, right? So she has to either increase taxes, which she said she wouldn't do, or cut spending. Now, if it's about cutting spending, I'll let her deal with the ramifications in her own party.
Yeah.
We had a plan to cut welfare by some £12 billion. We would,
which the Institute for Fiscal Studies said was, I think, difficult in the extreme.
Yeah, but they said that, I think, in 2010 when we said we would cut it by 12 billion, and we cut it by even more than 12 billion. So we absolutely welcome the challenge, but we would have executed on those cuts to welfare because post-COVID, the welfare budget has just ballooned. Rachel Reeves needs to set out what she's going to do on this. And I think part of the reason that markets are reacting the way they have so ferociously and putting up borrowing costs is because of the uncertainty, because she has boxed herself in so much. They don't know what is around the corner. And that lack of certainty, lack of stability is why we're in a situation where that headroom has effectively been wiped out by the markets.
Gareth, look at the Department of Business and Trade in which I serve. There was no provision in the departmental books when we arrived for the payments for the Horizon scandal. Your party passed legislation, rightly in the dog days of the last Parliament, to make sure that those postmasters and mistresses were given, but yet we came in, opened the books, and there was no provision. Oh, it'll be a call on the Treasury Reserve, we were told. In department after department after department, you were making unfunded spending commitments. The idea that you were responsible with the public finances is frankly laughable. You're not going to get a hearing until you say, yes, actually, we did, as the Labour Party, inherit a seriously impaired fiscal balance sheet on coming to office. It was necessary to take action, indeed to raise taxes to rectify that problem. You were making commitments like drunken sailors all over the place, which were simply unfunded.
Let me
we had to clean up your mess. So Horizon,
I understand the
what was the provision?
I understand the Labour lines on this. Look, on Horizon, seeing as you mention it, you're right. I think there was cross-party consensus on this, that we should compensate the victims of the Horizon
why no provision
scandal.
in the budget?
Well, let me tell you, when you're in the Treasury, you're dealing with other people's money. It's a novel concept to Labour politicians, but it's not our money. It's the public's money, and so you can't make a provision for a number that you haven't yet been given by the inquiry. And there wasn't a number yet provided as to the recommended amount of compensation.
So there was no provision.
And so, obviously, in-year budgets and in-year provision of the taxpayers' money, you are providing for unforeseen events like Horizon and like other things, right? Like the infected blood scandal. But you can't ring-fence money that you do not know the amount for.
So you accept
we would
there
have
was no
found
provision
the money
for either?
Well, we would have found the money, but what we wouldn't have done is we wouldn't have paid £8 billion to set up GB Energy, £7 billion to set up a National Wealth Fund. We wouldn't have paid 22% pay rises to junior doctors, which cost £9 billion. The answer here is not, would you not have put up taxes or would you spend less? We wouldn't have spent in the reckless way that they have already done within 6 months on these pet projects that are not going to deliver growth, which is ultimately the answer to all of the things that we're talking about. If they could grow the economy to the same level that the OBR predicted it would do in our March budget, we wouldn't be in this situation. Unfortunately, the OBR downgraded growth forecasts because of Rachel Reeves' decision.
Right. I mean, there is no growth, really, forecast, a little bit that is forecast. In terms of what we call the fiscal headroom, was it wise to borrow as much as Rachel Reeves outlined in that budget when there was £10 billion of potential headroom available to her. Now there is £1 billion. Hence, the markets have been spooked.
So there are movements in terms of the bond market, and indeed,
Yeah,
like
but
the
she's been left with no flexibility. Was it wise to borrow that much?
Let me try and finish the sentence. But the reality is one of the reasons that we inherited a significantly low growth and high inequality economy was because of an absence of investment, both public and private. So you criticise the National Wealth Fund, but if you look at the effect the National Wealth Fund is having already, we're crowding in private capital as well as deploying public capital. That's why we've made a major announcement in North Wales today. So the fact is, a key element of driving growth is raising productivity. Yeah. A key ingredient for driving productivity is increased investment. That's the judgment that we made, because actually we don't need to look in the crystal ball. We can look at the history books, and for 14 years we've had anemic growth while other countries have been growing significantly faster on the foundation of higher investment.
Right, so you're not going to reduce investment?
We believe that investment is fundamental to the kind of economy we want to run.
If Rachel Reeves is in difficulty, it will be spending cuts. I mean, as you say, you're not going to write the next fiscal statement. Let's talk about Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, sitting next to the Prime Minister, and Kemi Badenoch made a comment about whether and how long she might survive in that role. Is she out of the woods yet, Rachel Reeves?
Well, look, I think there's no suggestion that there's an organised plot to get rid of her, or either that there's any kind of dispute with the Prime Minister or Number 10. I mean, you know, Douglas will know from his time previously under a Labour government that you can get disputes between Prime Ministers and Chancellors.
Really? Well, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown wrote the playbook, didn't they, on this?
No idea what you're talking about.
But in this case, there is no suggestion that there's any disagreement over strategy. You know, they're both signed up to this. So in that sense, I don't think there's any suggestion that she is going to lose her job soon. And they've ruled out today any kind of emergency budget. I thought it was interesting that Keir Starmer did specifically say we can't tax our way out of your mess. He's talking about the Conservatives. You know, they are definitely, if they have to fill this kind of hole of any kind, it won't be taxes, they're saying, it will be spending cuts. And then that brings into play the rest of the Labour Party and the voices there who, you know, clearly feel they didn't come into power in order to make cuts to the welfare budget. But that is potentially what they are looking at, because Rachel Reeves is being very clear that they won't break these fiscal rules.
We had Sarah Champion, Labour MP, sitting here earlier on Politics Live, and when I put that to her, I mean, she said that is going to be really tough if there are spending cuts that she has to explain to her constituents, and there'll be many Labour MPs like her who will not be able to stomach it. She did say she probably would swallow it, but many of them won't.
So I've got a lot of time for Sarah. I think she's a very serious and formidable politician. But the point she makes is a fair one, which is none of us get to choose the circumstances that Labour inherit in coming to office.
You can make different choices.
Yeah, but if the suggestion is that that doesn't involve difficult and challenging choices on spending, on fiscal policy, people are kidding you on. The reality is it is hard. We do know the inheritance is tough, but we are fixing the foundations.
Let's talk about the Chagos Islands, brought up also by Kemi Badenoch in terms of what she calls a dud deal and a multi-billion-pound bill to pay, she calls it surrender something that is actually ours. This headline, the Financial Times, saying the UK is going to wait for Donald Trump's approval before signing the Chagos deal. That's because of the military base on Diego Garcia as part of the Chagos Islands. What is the latest, Vicki, on this?
Well, it is changing almost by the hour.
Yeah.
We heard that there was going to be a meeting of the Mauritian cabinet this morning, and they were going to sign it off. You know, it is worth saying that this was all started, these negotiations, under the last government. You know, this is to end decades of disputes over the status of the islands. You know, UN bodies have been putting pressure on the UK to sort out the sovereignty for a long time. But as you say, it is wrapped up in the fact that there's a military base there, which is, you know, shared with the Americans. Does the government now decide to wait for Donald Trump to come in? But, you know, it's the cost of it that Kemi Badenoch was talking about. So the idea that the UK government, as part of the deal, will provide a package of financial support to Mauritius, including annual payments.
£9 billion.
Fiscal headroom.
£9 billion. Is that a figure you recognise?
It's not a figure I'm familiar with, but I'm not close to the negotiations. My understanding are the negotiations are close to conclusion. But again, the reality is we inherited a set of negotiations that had been opened by James Cleverly, the then Foreign Secretary. There was legal challenge to the integrity of the base on the Chagos Islands. It's right and reasonable that the government acts responsibly. It was just kind of diminishing and opportunistic for Kemi Badenoch to somehow claim that a deal that her own party just a few months ago was actively pursuing is somehow the wrong deal. It's actually diminishing rather than enhancing when somebody tries to disavow what her own party's done.
Well, I mean, Gareth, it is a bit strange. It's curious, let's put it that way, because it was started by James Cleverly.
Here they go again, blaming everybody else. Look, there's only one person responsible for this deal that's on the table. That's the current Prime Minister, the Labour Prime Minister. Yes, of course, we had discussions with the Mauritius government, but no deal was put out there. But by the way, we don't have any details on this. Douglas has not been able to provide you with confirmation whether it's 9 billion. We don't know exactly how the base is going to be protected. We don't know whether we're going to be able to renew the lease, how long the lease is for. All we're asking for is more clarity and information about what is being negotiated here. This is about sovereign territory that we don't necessarily need to give up. Paying,
but do you want to give it? Are you in favour of giving it up then?
Do you want a deal or not?
Well, we'll look at any deal, an opportunity that puts in.
Well, why isn't there more clarity?
But we have no
why
detail.
Isn't there more detail on this?
Well, because the nature of any negotiations that you're conducting often are within the parameters of the negotiation room. Jonathan Powell, now the National Security
Advisor, it was botched, wasn't it? I mean, that's why it was
engaged
rejected.
in those discussions. But the truth is, this involves the Mauritian government, the United Kingdom government. There are very serious issues, not just of sovereignty, but of national security an issue here. I think it's perfectly reasonable for the negotiations to be conducted and then reasonably an account given of what's been concluded.
But if it's £9 billion at a time when Labour are telling us there's no money...
You can't even tell us whether you want a deal or not. It's just not serious politics.
Well, we do a lot better deal than whatever they're negotiating. I have to say, if we even do a deal...
Do you want a deal?
Well, again... You are in government now. You have to take responsibility. And we have to
I'm going to let you
do
the toing and froing, but we have to finish the programme, unfortunately. That's all we have time for today. Thank you to all of my guests for this part of the programme, and I will be talking to the former Labour leader, Jeremy Corbyn, on tomorrow's programme. Please do join me at 12:15. From all of us here, good afternoon.